There is a garden, there is a city, and there's a kingdom of God. And it is beautiful, and he is bringing it right now into our midst. Well, has our world ever changed from the time we began this series 10 weeks ago, Breaking Bad, Becoming Good, The Road to Character? I mean, can you imagine 10 weeks ago what we were thinking and how we were living then? And if anybody would have heard the word corona being mentioned, nobody would have associated that word with the virus 10 weeks ago. But wow, has our world ever changed? As we have been exploring this complex, beautiful, mysterious thing called character and virtue, and how we become the right kind of people that God wants to use to really make a difference in the world. For those of you who might be joining like for the first time and you haven't been a part of this particular series, we spent 10 weeks, and there you can see all the different topics that we have gone over. We talked about what character is and why it matters so much. We talked about how easy it is to be breaking bad, and sometimes how difficult it is to be in this journey of becoming good. And then we began to move into some really specific topics, and I'm just very grateful for our entire communications team. We've had different speakers week after week, and they have just done a marvelous job bringing their best insights to you about these different topics. And I think it is a little bit ironic, maybe that's not quite the appropriate Christian word, but there's just something very significant that the last message that we had planned many months ago to finish the series is on this thing called trust. And wow, what a time when we need to move into some deeper levels of trust. Now, the message today is entitled Ruthless Trust and Taking the Long View. And I'm using the word ruthless trust because I was very moved by a book that came out many years ago by a man named Brennan Manning, and the name of that book was Ruthless Trust. And in that book, Manning described a way of life that was very compelling and motivating for me. It was a way of life that was inviting me and anybody who would read to move into a posture where we are going to wind up engaging with God with the deepest levels of faith, hope, and love that we can give to Him. And for the long haul, not just for a short season, not just for a week or two or even a couple of months, but ruthless trust for the long haul. And if you've been a part of the Living Word at all, you know you're going to hear this. You've heard this next quote I've said many times, but the Christian journey is all about a long obedience in the same direction. And that long obedience, as we keep on giving that long obedience, in the end, the quote goes on and says, that's what makes a life worth living. That is what has brought something really worthwhile into our experiences, this long obedience. Or called a long love in the same direction, a long faith and a long hope in the same direction, a long ruthless trust in the same direction. That is what makes life worth living. So we're talking about trust this morning, and here's the word cloud, and we'll put it up there for you. And I'm really grateful for our team who each week they've created a little word cloud that's the cluster of ideas that's associated in this case with trust. Just take a moment and look at those really good words. Words like faith and hope, confidence. This persevering, enduring, patient sort of mentality about the heart. And then you can also see what the opposite looks like, living with doubt and hesitation. There's fear and insecurity. And those things are always our options. We live with trust or we live with doubt. But how about right now with our current season of life? These things are very significant and very powerful for us. Now, this series is ending today. The 10-week series on the road to character is ending today, but the road to character goes on and on, doesn't it? And we never stop walking the road to character. We never stop on that long, obedient pursuit of the goodness that God has for us. That's going to continue for the rest of our years. And in fact, that is why I wanted to end this series on trust, because we're going to need to have this ruthless, long trust in the same direction if we're going to really see all the things materialize in our lives that God wants to. Now, by the way, we had a couple things planned for the next few weeks, and with the COVID-19, all of those plans have gone out the window, and we are now planning to have a 3-week series where we're going to help you dive into some of the most significant realities, the most difficult questions that we are now asking, and trying to figure out how do we answer with the COVID-19 reality going on. So we'll be starting that next week, and we'll be pushing some information out to you. We talk about timeline here. If you've been in any of our leadership classes, we like the language of timeline. And what timeline just simply means is what's the narrative of your life? What's the story of your life? And you can go back and you can look at different things that are taking place, and you can have a sense that God has done certain things at certain times. Well, what I want to do for a moment is just, hey, let's place ourselves right here today on our timeline. So it's March 15, 2020. Now, I have a few kind of self-assessment questions for you to think about for March 15, 2020. So first, let's think about the number of problems that you are dealing with. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 means like you don't have any problems at all, and by the way, that may have been true a little bit ago, but now with the COVID-19 thing going on, we've all got a couple of problems that we didn't have a few months ago. So I'm going to be really surprised if anybody's saying, hey, I've got no problems at all. I've got more problems today than I did a few weeks ago, as we're just trying to figure out how do we work as a large spiritual entity? How do we get word out? I mean, we've got some problems, and we're trying to figure those things out, and we will. But how many problems do you have? Now, 10 means you have like nothing but problems. And, you know, it's really interesting. On any given particular Sunday morning, we have people that they're all over the map from 1 to 10. We have people that are part of our church, 1 to 10, from no problems to life seems to be nothing but problems. But how about you? You know, what number would you say right now about the number of problems that are in your life? Okay, here's the second self-assessment. So problems are those things that are actually happening all around you and happening to you. Now my next question is, what's your pain level about those problems? Now, by the way, even though I have some more problems going on, my pain levels are still relatively low. But, you know, every now and then I go into a hospital and I'm talking to somebody who's just been in surgery. And every now and then a doctor will come by, and the doctor comes in. And I remember this real clearly from one person I had visited that had some major back surgery. And the doctor looks and says, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your pain level? And the person I was visiting didn't answer for the moment. And said, well, maybe about a 7 or 8. Okay, that's my pain level. You know, the doctor's trying to get a sense of how are you doing? What's going on inside of you? With what's just happened. And my friend answered, it's about a 7 or 8. Well, you know, the doctor talks for a little bit, then walks out, and then my friend looks at me and says, no, it's more like an 11 or 12, but I just didn't want to look like a wimp. What's your pain level about your problems? 1 means you like have no pain at all, even though you have lots of problems, you're just, you know, you're emotionally okay. And number 10 says, man, my life is just full of pain. I mean, I don't have a single day that goes by where there's not pain in my experience. Okay, so now you have a number for your problems, and you have a number for your sort of like pain level. Now here's one more. Let me ask about your perspective. What's your perspective? What's your attitude? What's your demeanor about your problems and your pain? And by the way, let's go back to the word cloud for a moment, all right? And here's how I want you to use that. 10 means you're living with the perspective of trust and confidence, security, and you're living with those things in a way that you're just plugging on, and you're persevering, and you're enduring, and man, you're just at a really, really good space. That's what it means to be at a 10. But on the other hand, maybe your problems and pain have kicked you down closer to a 1, and that is where you're living with doubt and fear and hesitation. So what's your perspective number? And I'm going to want you to hold on to those 3 kind of assessments on your problems, your pain, and your perspective as we make our way through this morning. All of us have questions. Here's some of the questions that I know people are always asking and thinking about. Basically, they kind of go like this. Am I going to make it? Will I get through these times that I'm currently in? What's it going to feel like going through these times? Am I strong enough to get through this? I mean, can I get through this reasonably intact? What's it going to look like for me to get through this particular season of my life? We're always asking those questions. I mean, just put aside the COVID-19 situation that's going on right now. I mean, those are just questions that we're always asking. Now, we're not always consciously aware of our answers, but we're always asking those questions about our problems and our pain. And in addition, we're always kind of asking, so where is God in all of this? You know, how is God with me? Is God going to do something about this? Am I going to be able to get through this with God? So these are the questions that we are always processing and concerned with as we're dealing with our problems and our pain. Can I trust God with this? At the core of Christianity is what I call a dynamic interaction or a dynamic intersection of the life of God and your life. Now, let me just kind of give you a visual example of what I mean. By the way, let's start out with just thinking about another person. You know, whenever two people come together, you and another, there is a sphere of dynamic interaction. That right there, that's where two lives come together. Sometimes they converge. Sometimes it seems that they're colliding. But at that intersection of two lives, something very dynamic takes place. And here's what we know even about people, is that dynamic interaction can be very messy. It can be very mysterious. It can be complex. It can be confusing as we're trying to figure out the other person, as we're trying to navigate this relationship. I mean, that happens in every relationship, a dynamic intersection and interaction of our lives. Now, if we take that same idea and apply it to God, we are now talking about a much bigger person. This is not an interaction of equals by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I asked our tech team, could they kind of give us a better visual image of what it is like for our individual lives to be having this collision and this convergence with this immense presence called the Lord God Almighty. And wow, is that interaction ever full of mystery and beauty and messiness? And sometimes we get a little bit confused about that interaction. And sometimes we come to some wrong conclusions about that interaction. But listen, that's just the nature of you and I having our lives impacted by the immensity of the one called God. It is a very, very mysterious and complex reality. Now, here's what the divine interaction means. It means that God is always doing something, and we have a couple of words we love to use, and that is the word grace, this unconditional commitment of God to you, this unconditional working of God in your life, God's love, God's mercy. Those are the words that are part of God's interaction, the work that God is doing. And then, as we've been going through this particular series on character, and as we're talking about the grace of God making some changes in our lives, we've been talking about, and now on our part, there is this pursuit of virtue. We've used various kinds of language and phrases, but one of the ones one of our favorites is like, we're making every effort on our end to respond to this immense grace and love and mercy of God that's coming in and just simply changing things. And now we're making every effort. But guys, I'll just be honest, that's a kind of a mysterious interaction, and it raises a couple questions. You know, what's God doing and what am I doing? Now, I'm going to just jump ahead for one moment. So for our talk today, as we're looking at this thing called ruthless trust, and am I going to make it? Will I actually endure to the end? The dynamic is this: there's something that God is doing to preserve you. God is working to keep you, to protect you, to guard you, to hold you so close. That's God's work. And then our work is we're just called to persevere. We're called to endure. We are called to make every effort we can to respond in faith, hope, love, and ruthless trust to this preserving work of God that's going on in us. And how those two things come together, look, it's a mystery. It gets kind of messy. But that's what it means to be a follower of God. That's just where we live. Now, by the way, every author in the New Testament acknowledges that messy convergence of God's life and our life. And every one of them winds up sort of wrestling with this immensity of grace that is coming into us, and at the same time, our response to be faithful. I just want to read a couple verses for you out of Titus chapter. Actually, I'm going to look at just a couple of different things in Titus. If you're not familiar with Titus, it's one of the called pastoral letters. The Apostle Paul had a couple of proteges. The Apostle Paul wrote a lot of the letters in the New Testament, and a couple of his main proteges that he started churches with and turned them over. One was named Timothy, and Timothy gets 2 letters, and another was named Titus. Titus gets a letter. And if you're looking at Titus, it's actually a pretty amazing short letter. Paul spends a good part of his first chapter just talking about the qualities of character that are required for those who would be leaders. And I mean, I just underlined a bunch of the words there, and I bet I've got about 15 different words that are underlined. They should be this, they should be this, they should be this, and they shouldn't be this, and they shouldn't be this. That's a good part of chapter 1. And then he moves into chapter 2, and he's going to continue with this theme of character. And so he talks, first of all, to the older men, then he talks to the older women, then he talks to the younger women, then he has words for the younger men. And once again, there's 15 or 20 different words of character that he's encouraging to these different groups of people. There is a fair amount of overlap of those words. But the whole first part of chapter 2 is Paul saying, hey, this is the character that we didn't need to make, Paul's making that the character that we need to make every effort to pursue. But now watch what happens in verse 11. After all this talk about character, for the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. Why can we have this vigorous pursuit of goodness? Because the grace of the immense one we call God has appeared and is offering it to you and I. Now, but then watch what happens. What does this grace do? Well, this grace right away has a character agenda. The grace of God teaches you and I to say no to a couple things. No to ungodliness, no to worldly compassions. It tells us to say yes to living self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. I mean, look, the grace of God has an agenda. The agenda of God's grace is the transformation of our lives. Oh, and then Paul goes on in verse 13. And so now he kind of links this grace of God that has done something powerful for us and this character pursuit that we're having. And now he links it together with the future hope that we have. We wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. I mean, Paul can hardly stop just piling up words. This Jesus Christ has given himself for us to redeem us. By the way, redeem us from what? Well, redeem us from wickedness, from all the breaking bad that's so easy. And to purify us, the becoming good dynamic. But by the way, I love this juxtaposition of grace and virtue. And he continues in chapter 3. Once again, he starts out in chapter 3, but I've underlined the words. So there's about another 10 character qualities. And then verse 4, listen to this. And he says all this because the kindness and love of our God, our Savior, appeared, and he saved us. I mean, for Paul, it just all flows together. God's grace, God's saving work, God's redeeming work, and our faithful, loving, obedient, trusting response. He saved us, not because we had already done good, virtuous things. I mean, that's not why he saved us. No, he saved us when we were a wreck, and he saved us so that we could wind up becoming different. He just goes on and he washed us. There's all this rich language of the Holy Spirit. I just want to jump down though to, I'm going to jump down to verse 8. Paul said, well, everything I'm saying is trustworthy, and I want you to stress these things. Titus, stress these things to the congregation. Stress these things. So that those, listen to this, so that those who have trusted in God, in this immense providential, protecting, guarding, safekeeping, saving, grace-filled work of God, may be careful. For what? To devote ourselves to doing what is good. I mean, listen, there's no contradiction. There's not even a tension in the biblical writers about this divine interaction. God's grace is beautiful beyond words. God's power is immense beyond understanding. And it is at work in our lives. And to that is just says, now respond. Respond. Don't break bad and start to become good by the grace and power of God. There's no contradiction. I know most of you have heard of a guy named John Newton. If you haven't, he's the guy who wrote Amazing Grace, one of the most famous hymns that the church has ever sung. I want to tell you a little bit. So, we've been talking a little bit about timeline. I'm going to tell you a few things about the timeline of God's immensity interacting with little John Newton and his particular life. So this is a couple centuries ago. He's born in 1725. And he winds up dying in 1807. He lived 82 years, which, by the way, for that time of life was simply remarkable, especially in light of all of the things that he had been through. His body was literally a wreck, and somehow he lived for 82 years. Now, It's not until 1772, when he is about 48 years old, that he actually writes the words to Amazing Grace. He's 48 years old. He writes the poetry. And on New Year's Day of 1973, he uses that for the first time on a New Year's Day sermon. First time the words Amazing Grace are distributed out to anybody in the public. Now then a couple years later in 1779, those words were put to music and they were published in a hymnal, and very, very quickly it spread and it became one of the most loved worship songs that they were singing back in those days, the song Amazing Grace. Now again, all that, that's happening. He's 48, he's 49, a couple years later in his mid-50s, it's being produced. Let me take you back to a little bit earlier, because in 1736, at age 11, John Newton is apprenticed to a ship, and he joins the Merchant Marine of the British Empire at age 11. And right away, he begins to move into very tumultuous and very, very bad experiences. At age 18 in 1743, age 18, for the first time, he joins up with a slave vessel. He becomes a slave trader at age 18. Pretty hard to imagine the things they began to see and the things that he began to participate in at age 18. 5 years later, while he's on one of his slave trading voyages, a terrible storm erupts. It is a horrific storm. Sailors are being washed overseas, overboard into the ocean. Newton, literally, where he had been standing a couple of moments earlier, a wave him crashing in had washed another person right over, and in sheer terror of losing his life, he falls down to his knees and just begs God to save him. So at that point, basically, he had his conversion experience of the grace of God. But he didn't leave the slave trade. He remained a slave trader. In fact, not only does he remain a slave trader, after he has been converted by God's grace, he actually becomes a captain of a slave trading ship and has many, many times when he's just taking slaves from Africa out of their country. Following this timeline so far? In 1755, 7 years after his conversion, he finally gets out of the slave trade in terms of he stops being a captain of a slave trading vessel. But you know why he did? Was it out of conviction that the slave trading thing was deeply immoral and he needed to get out of it as a good follower of Jesus? No, that wasn't the reason. He had an epileptic seizure and it made him unfit to any longer be at sea. And so that's why he stopped being a captain of a slave trading vessel. But then even after that, for another 5 years, he remains making financial profit off of the slave trade industry. It's not until 1760 that he actually gets out of the slave trade business altogether. 12 years after his conversion. You see, every now and then we sing the song Amazing Grace. We think, oh, it was so wonderful. Here was John Newton, this wretched person, and he has this wonderful conversion experience. He writes Amazing Grace the next day, and he's living this glorious life forever. No, that's not what happened. He has this conversion experience, and his life remains a wreck for another 12 years. It's not until 1760 he starts to make every effort about pursuing virtue. And by the way, many years later in life, as he gets further down his timeline, he kind of reflects back and says, you know, I'm really not sure Amazing Grace came into my life when I thought it did. My life was so broken, it remained so messy, I remained so morally compromised. I'm not quite sure that the amazing grace of God had actually entered my life when I thought it did, because not only did he believe that amazing grace forgives us radically, but he also believed amazing grace begins a transformation, and he saw so little transformation until 1760. But then something began to happen in his life, and wow, is he ever getting serious. And he feels a call to ministry. He begins to study and prepare for the ministry. In 1764, he is ordained, and he spends the rest of his years being a pastor, to actually in pretty small churches. But it's not until very late in life that he becomes an abolitionist. Now, he preached against it and he taught his people it was wrong, but he didn't really join the abolition movement until much, much later in life. And it was in 1788 that for the first time, by the way, he is an older man. He's now been following Jesus for a long time. In 1788, he publishes a 48-page pamphlet. It goes to every member of the British Parliament, and it is a strong word against the slave trade and all the damage it's doing, not only to the African people, but to all of those who are participating. And on the first page of that pamphlet, here's what he says. He says, this pamphlet is a confession which comes too late. It will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which now my heart shudders. That's the journey we're on. I mean, listen, when Newton wrote the words, "Amazing grace that saved a wretch like me," he knew just how wretched he had been and all that he had done. And by the way, the slave trade was just part of it. There's other things about his life that were equally wretched. Listen, we all have a timeline. Everybody has a timeline. We're all someplace in the midst of a timeline. We're all on a journey. We're on a journey where there's a divine interaction taking place of the immensity of God's love and grace and mercy and power, and then our making every effort response to what God is doing. We're on this journey, and we don't always do the journey as well as we would like to do. Let me tell you, though, a couple of lessons that I hope you're learning from Titus text and from the Newton story. Your timeline is always a timeline of the dynamic interaction of God with you. That's always what's going on. Second lesson, you can't control or manipulate or force in any way what God is going to do in your life. God is God, and God is going to do what he wants to do in your life. And you just have to trust that God will be God and allow him to be God. Number three, you are fully responsible for your side of the divine interaction. That intersection of God's life and yours. You are fully responsible for that. You are required to make every effort. And Newton, as he got further and further along, he realized he had not been making every effort to the divine invitations that God had for him. And there came a point when he began to make every effort that's when suddenly his life began to change in radical, wonderful ways. But here's probably what's most important about these lessons from the timeline. And Newton just talks about this all through his autobiography. In the moment, in any particular moment, you can't really understand, you can't really make sense out of what's going on in the moment. You just can't, because you're in the moment. Kierkegaard, we've told you this before, he has a brilliant insight about this. We are all living life forward. We're all moving into the future of our timeline. But we don't really understand what's going on until we get a little bit away and we can look back and we now have a sense of, oh, that's what was going on. You see, we're in the midst of something. We can't make enough sense out of it. There's not enough of it has happened to us. We haven't had enough of a distance to get a sense of what's going on. You know, the experience isn't over there, and nor is God finished with us there. It's not until we start to get further down the road that now we start to have the ability to make some sense out of what was going on, to find some meaning out of what was going on. We live life forward, but we only understand it looking back. Man, that's just the story of what it means for our whole team to be kind of pastoring the lives of people. I mean, I'm always having conversations with people that they are right now in the moment of something. Boy, the problems are big and the pain is deep, and they can hardly make sense out of what's going on right now because they're still in the moment. Now, I know that later on they'll get past that moment, but right now they're in the moment and they can barely get their minds around what's taking place. About a week ago, I was at a fundraising event, and there was a fundraising event for an organization that works with developmentally disabled adults. And while there's a wonderful story being told of now a young man and his parents and all that is going on in his life that is so beautiful and so full of redemption. But you know, back when the child would have been born in those early years, I know that back then, those parents had very little ability to understand, wow, what is the meaning of what's going on with his life and with our life, and where is this going to go? But now, 20, 25 years down the road, they can look back, and now they can make so much more sense out of, find so much more meaning in what was going on in those things. But back then, they're just trying to hold on, or not. Man, you get a diagnosis you don't want to hear. You hear the word cancer. I mean, I've hardly ever taught the person that when they've heard that word cancer, it's like suddenly, I mean, their lives are now reeling, and they can barely wrap their heart around what they just heard. And in that moment when you hear, hey, it's cancer, you can't find sufficient meaning because it's the moment. You're going to have to get a little bit past that. You're going to have to start to see what is going on, what's happening. But in that moment, you're going to have a couple of choices. I either live with ruthless trust or I don't. Man, over the years, I've had so many beautiful stories of a marriage, of couples that their marriage had come to the brink where it was over, it was ending. And in that moment, neither person thought this could possibly be salvaged. It was over. Because they're in the moment. And will they have ruthless trust or not? Will they choose to persevere or not? Will they choose to pursue virtue and goodness, or will they choose to break bad? And I tell you, I've seen so often when they say, oh, we're going to hang in there, we're going to pursue becoming good, we're going to choose virtue, we're going to choose to persevere. And as the days, weeks, months, and sometimes much longer goes by, there is the slow salvaging and restoration. And every now and then I talk to a couple and say, we can hardly remember what it was like. We know it was really, really bad back then, but it's become so good now we can barely remember what that was like. See, that's timeline perspective. John Newton, when he was 18 and on the slave trader, when he was 25 and on the slave trader, he just didn't have perspective about where God was taking his life in the moment. He had no ability to have perspective. And what we want to do is just help you right now in this particular season of life, when in addition to all the normal problems that you had and the pain that you're experiencing, now we've got this COVID-19 thing going on. There's a whole bunch more problems that have been added. Like in this moment, it's going to be very hard for you and I to make sense out of what is going on. We're going to have to get a little bit further down the road. And we will get a little further down the road, and we will be able to look back and make better meaning out of that. But right now, the need is for you and I to choose the option of ruthless trust in the God whose immensity is impacting our lives. Romans 8:28. We know that in all things, God is working for the good of those who love him. In all things, God is working for the good of those who love him. John Newton, here's a couple things he said. Now listen to the perspective he gained. You don't have this in the moment, you get this a little bit later. I am not what I ought to be. I am not what I want to be. I am not what I hope to be in another world. But still, I am not what I once used to be. And by the grace of God, I am what I am. That's the man who has gained perspective. And here's one of the verses from Amazing Grace. Just think about how much he had to go through to get this perspective. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. It's been grace that has brought us safe so far. And it's going to be grace that will lead us home. That's perspective. 30 minutes ago, I asked you to get a couple numbers. One number was about your problems. Now, by the way, that number has not changed in the last 30 minutes. You still have the same number of problems now that you did 30 minutes ago. And I asked you to kind of give a number for what's the pain that you are feeling. And my assumption is that the pain number probably hasn't changed very much from 30 minutes ago. But what about that perspective number? Can we put the word cloud back up? Can you already sense the invitation from God for you and I to live with ruthless trust. For you and I to live with this long love, faith, and hope in the same direction. Are you really feeling that invitation getting stronger and stronger? Do you already have the sense that you are being kept by the power of God? That is 1 Peter chapter 1. We are kept by the power of God. And then in 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter says, now that you're being kept by the power of God, keep on keeping on. That's the phrase. God keeps you and I, and now we keep on keeping on. That's our invitation from God as we are in this particular season of our lives.